Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight with the Princeton Public Library for our presentation with Sam Farmer, author of A Long Walk Down a Winding Road. My name is Nora, and I'm part of the programming team at the library. A few things before we get fully started. This program is being recorded and will be available on demand almost immediately following the end of the program. Please subscribe to the library's Crowdcast page to connect with all of our future programming and to catch recordings of past events. We will be leaving the chat on briefly at the beginning, but then turning it off during the main portion of the program. However, at any point, please use the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen to ask questions that you'd like to hear us answer at the end of the presentation. If someone posts a question that you would also like to see answered, you can upvote it to make sure it gets our attention. If you are interested in checking out Sam's book, you will also see a green Buy the Book button directly below me, which will take you to bookshop.org. Sam's book is also available as a paperback and an ebook from Barnes & Noble and other online retailers. So our author for tonight, Sam Farmer, describes himself as wearing many hats in his professional and personal lives. He's a father, a husband, a musician, a computer consultant, and an autism spectrum community contributor. Farmer had a late diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome, which is now encompassed under the umbrella diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, and is the father of a child who is also on the autism spectrum. To further his mission of paying forward the lessons and support of his parents, he writes blogs and articles, offers coaching videos, and presents at conferences to share his stories and insights into achieving greater happiness and success in life, despite challenges and adversity. So please welcome me in joining Sam to the screen.
Hello, everybody. Good evening.
Welcome. How are you today, Sam?
Doing good, Nora. How are you?
Doing very well, thank you.
Very good.
Start with sort of the beginning. Since we are the Princeton Public Library, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your early life in Princeton.
It wasn't until I was 19 years old, due to the fact that I stayed back a year early on in my education, that I essentially moved on from Princeton to go to college. And after that, grad school and a whole multitude of jobs that eventually led to the job that I'm still in now, 25 years later. But yeah, it's my original stomping grounds, just where I grew up, where I went to grade school, where I was born and raised, and with no regrets.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Did you have any favorite spots in town when you were a kid?
Pizza Star, Hoagie Haven. To my knowledge, they're still both around, at least I hope they are.
Still popular favorites.
The library, of course. The older version of the Princeton Public Library before it was reconstructed. The Battlefield State Park, Palmer Stadium, where when running on the cross-country team at Hun, we would often go to run up and down the bleachers, and where I would go to see just how quickly I could run a mile in on a flat surface, to kind of get myself ready for cross-country season. The university, all the usual places.
Nice.
Yeah.
So in your book, you describe yourself as the owner of an autism spectrum profile. And you also talk about how autism spectrum should not be referred to as a disorder, but rather a unique set of cognitive and behavioral traits resulting from an alternative neurology. So I liked these ideas, and I wanted to have you talk about them a little bit in terms of when you first got your diagnosis. I imagine it was a tough time, but you've taken it as sort of a moment of self-discovery rather than just a barrier. Can you talk about that?
Well, it was a major shock at first, as you can imagine, largely because I had a hard time reconciling what I had just found out about myself with what I knew about other people who I knew that were on the autism spectrum, and I couldn't reconcile all of that. But fortunately, I was born an optimist. I had two parents who were optimistic at heart. And when you're fortunate enough to have an optimistic frame of mind, you're able to get past certain difficulties without too much difficulty, that with a little bit of time, it just kind of worked itself out on its own. That, you know, this is part of who I am. And that if I continue to think in terms of what is a key aspect of who I am as being a disability or a disorder, that that won't do anything to help my sense of self-esteem. So I figured, you know, if I'm going to be happy and successful living with this, then I ought to be looking at it in a positive light, if anything, for the sake of my own self-image.
Right.
And that's a very prominent ongoing theme throughout the book, is how I went about learning how to love myself, because that was a very long, lifelong, almost fight to reach that point. But thankfully, I've felt for several years now that I had reached that point of arriving at really feeling strong with myself, happy with myself, accepting of who I am, even to the point, thankfully, of being able to embrace who I am, because that's just the optimist in me.
Wonderful. I think I briefly noted it, but we'll note again that you received your diagnosis as an adult.
Correct.
You as a child had been identified as having a learning disability, which helped you receive some assistance and services as a young person through the advocacy of your mother. And when you finally decided to sort of be talking in the book that you were at first hesitant to maybe talk to people outside of your family about this diagnosis, but that you were eventually inspired to kind of pay forward the work of your mother and start to be more open about your diagnosis. Can you talk about the beginning of that journey?
Well, for whatever reason, and perhaps with good reason, because I was fortunate to have a very wonderful mother. And this whole mission of paying it forward that I talk about in the book was strengthened even more when my father passed away. And that was a little more than a year after my mother passed. But where my mother went first, it was then that, for whatever reason, I felt compelled to kind of follow in her footsteps, to try to keep her spirit alive. She led a life of giving greatly of herself to other people, to me, to my brothers, to my father, and through her chosen profession of doing social work, which is a very giving profession, as was the case with my father as a doctor. Just two people very giving of themselves, that I figured, in order to honor their collective legacy, but initially my mother's legacy, let's try to help people the way they did. And I determined that probably the best way I could do that was through my writing and through my presentations of giving thoughts and ideas and insights on how people can achieve happiness and success in life in spite of various challenges and adversities that I think we all face, whether we're autistic or not. And that I could best help people that way, in terms of helping them, maybe to help themselves, assuming that they would have the kinds of challenges that I had, that it would be those people who I could probably help the most. And I'm careful in the book to really only get into those areas that I had to tackle and work hard at, and not delve into areas where I felt I wasn't well qualified to speak to. And so to me, that brings a tone of honesty and being genuine in the book in that sense, that I only speak to what I feel I can effectively speak to in terms of the book's self-help content in various areas of life.
Wonderful. Just reading about your mom in your book, I think she'd be very pleased with how you're living that legacy for her.
I think she would. Yeah.
So in writing this book, it's clear that it takes a lot of self-reflection to kind of go through your experiences. You talk in the book about how there were many steps in your journey to social awareness. As a young person, you had sort of a lack of self-awareness or connection to yourself. Can you talk about how that journey of self-reflection sort of began for you? And now, having written the book, is it still something that you do fairly regularly?
Well, the best way for me really to describe that is to call it a process, a very long process of small steps forward, many of which were taken by learning a lot of lessons, some of them the hard way. And just having a lot of help from all the right people, for which I've been very fortunate to have a lot of good people, qualified clinicians, my parents to help me along. And it was just a very gradual evolution in my life of along the way, just becoming more aware, becoming more in tune with my surroundings, becoming smarter and wiser as I went through life's experiences and in small steps.
Yeah. I mean, I think self-reflection can be very important and very difficult for probably most people, trying to look back on their experiences and draw wisdom from that. Are you a journaler, or how do you kind of access those memories, or is it all just sort of a personal internal process?
Certainly internal. And fortunately, I have a good memory of things that I went through, things that happened, various people in my life, my experiences. Without having that kind of memory, arguably, I wouldn't have been able to write this book. Granted that a big chunk of it is memoir material, which kind of gives context to the self-help material. But yeah, it's a lot of inner reflection and just thinking about what I've learned and what I've gone through, both good and bad. I make the argument in the book that the harder experiences in my life were certainly of equal value to the positive experiences in my life, in the sense that they were opportunities really for growth. And again, I'm fortunate to have that kind of optimistic outlook, that it really is all in how you look at things. You can look at things, either with the glass half empty or half full, that age-old cliche, but it's a cliche for a good reason. And that the hard experiences, the adversity, processing it, think about why it happened, maybe what you can do about it, the kind of help that you would need to get past it, really helped to make me so smarter, to strengthen me, and to build self-esteem and inner strength. Just going through that life process, and getting the right help was critical. We arguably all could use help from other people, to varying degrees. And I was fortunate enough to have the help and to grab it and use it to get stronger and smarter and to develop into the person that I am today. And that's another powerful theme in the book, is to go get help if you really need it. A lot of people think that going for help is a sign of weakness. I think of it as the opposite. I think, if anything, that it's a sign of strength, that it shows that you have the courage and the desire to change, to better things. And so that's what I did, and it paid off. Excellent.
So thinking about kind of how that journey has been for you, thinking about it in terms of being a father also to someone who is on the autism spectrum, and how I know your son's diagnosis was part of what helped lead to your own. So as you've been raising him, are there specific things that you're trying to focus on for your son based on your own experiences, things that if you had known as a younger person, you wished had been done for you, or that you had known about? Are there specific tools that you're trying to give him?
I actually don't see my son or spend as much time with him to the extent that my wife does. And thankfully, I have a wife who is very smart, who has her eyes wide open to things, who has a good sense of intuition, and who has very good motherly instincts, that really most, admittedly, of what he learns from her, and some from me. He knows, like he knows of himself, that I too am on the autism spectrum, and we share that bond, and it's profound, to see him deal with some of the challenges that I dealt with. And at the same time, it's really interesting to see that he is much better at certain things at his age than I was when I was his age. And I'm grateful that he benefited from having a very, very early diagnosis, just a little bit before he was 2 years old, where even though I knew about my learning disability early on, I didn't know about my spectrum profile until I was 40. Some people wait a lifetime and never find out. Other people find out when they're older than I am. I mean, it runs the whole gamut of when you find out or if you find out. But that's a bond that we share. And I'm there for him. As he gets older, certainly he's going to need advice. And my wife knows, and I know that I have a unique perspective, and that we have things in common that I can almost foresee the kind of journey that he's going to have as he gets older. I can only assume that it'll at least be similar to what my path was. And I'll be able to advise him and guide him accordingly if he needs that guidance. Again, if he needs it, because he has a very good mother looking after him while I'm busy working and doing other things. And I keep very busy providing for my family, while my wife arguably has the harder job of kind of being the full-time mom, but she does very, very well in that area. So.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Sort of along those lines, while you're doing so much of this work. I know you do a lot of advocacy. You do a lot of speaking, both with this book and on general topics.
Yeah.
Are there specific things that you often get questions about when either people who have had like late diagnoses or are parents of children with autism? Do you find that you get a lot of the same questions from them over and over again?
Not really. The questions that I have gotten um, are of a wide enough variety that I haven't really found that I spend that much time talking to other people with late diagnoses or answering questions about it. So not necessarily. I don't see much repetition coming from people in that regard. Usually when I do events, they're either in-person or virtual events centered around my book. Or if I'm making public appearances, I'm not talking about the book. I'm talking about some issue of importance to the autism spectrum community. I'm talking about things that the folks who head the organizations that have these events and that invite me to speak, I'm speaking to those kinds of subjects. That question actually doesn't really come up much of what do I do if I'm facing a late diagnosis. But with that said, as I was going through the publicity campaign to publicize the book, one media outlet did ask me to write an article with advice for people facing a late diagnosis. And that article and many, many other articles that I've written in addition to the book are all on my website, samfarmerauthor.com. So I have written about it, but I haven't answered many questions really about what it's like to face a late diagnosis and what should I do if I'm in that situation.
Sure.
Yeah.
So going back into your book, you have a section where you talk about bullying that you had experienced both as a child and then some later instances as well. Are you seeing, sort of as you go through life, are you seeing that there has been a change in the way that people understand people with autism? Are you seeing sort of an overall change in maybe acceptance or people less likely to bully people that they perceive as different, or are you seeing sort of the same behavior?
Thankfully, from what I've been able to gather in the media and just in general, what I see is a wider acceptance. I should say a wider awareness of autism, and with that greater awareness, somewhat of an increase in acceptance, but with awareness and acceptance being two very different things. From what I can gather, they don't always go hand in hand. You still have plenty of people on the spectrum getting bullied. You have plenty of non-autistic people getting bullied who maybe have some of the challenges that I had. And that's an argument that I make in the book, is that autistic and non-autistic people have more in common with each other than we might think, because many of us share the same challenges. Maybe they're a little harder to conquer or a little more acute if you're on the spectrum, but the challenges themselves are the same. But again, awareness and acceptance are two different things. But thankfully, relative to when I was growing up, I feel that both are certainly much improved. And I think that's due to the fact that autism faces a much, much higher rate of diagnosis in recent years than when I was growing up, which is what I kind of attribute to why I was not diagnosed as a child and hadn't been diagnosed until a much older age. It's being diagnosed a lot more often now than it ever was prior. And I would expect that to continue. Yeah.
I think one of the things that ends up being a problem or a point of contention is that there are a lot of stereotypes, I think, that people perceive about people who are on the autism spectrum, and those can be fairly harmful. I know one of the ones you mention in your book is the idea of being emotionless, and you talk about instead being sort of emotionally stoic in
Yes.
the way that you present. And I was interested in this topic, especially with you being a musician, which, I mean, music is, you know, a little bit of math and a lot of feelings all sort of
Correct.
put together.
Yes.
Can you talk sort of about like how kind of the role music has played in your life and in sort of forming relationships?
Essential, absolutely essential. A lot of people say that one way to cope with autism and to build self-esteem is to cultivate a talent. And in my family, certainly in terms of the fact that my parents, my grandparents, on my father's side mostly, my grandfather's brothers and all kinds of cousins in music, that it just ended up being music. To my father's credit, he very much encouraged music, knowing that it would be something that I wouldn't just enjoy, but that I could be very good at. He also recommended that I be a cross-country runner and that I play tennis. And for him, that was just 3 out of 3. He picked 3 things he knew I would enjoy, that he knew I would be good at. And that really helped me along my journey of building self-esteem. But with music, it's just an alternative means of communication, an alternative way to convey feelings that you might not feel comfortable conveying just by talking or through other typical forms of communication, nonverbal communication, that particularly as a songwriter, it empowered me to write certain songs that I did, which served as a coping mechanism. Particularly as a heterosexual male teenager, when I started writing songs, that, as you'd expect, many of the songs that I wrote were about women, young women who I was attracted to, where those relationships didn't quite pan out. I think largely because of social skills and social competency challenges that I write about in the book, that I could always turn to my songwriting and channel my feelings through songs where I had a great deal of difficulty conveying feelings to certain women who I knew and who I was attracted to. And I would often go to extremes with them. With some of them, I would go overboard and wear my heart on my sleeve, maybe a little too much. And then with others, I would be like perfectly shy and not really be able to tell them how I felt. And it was going back and forth between these extremes, knowing a good number of women who were very attractive and kind, who I was attracted to for those reasons, that often it could become emotionally very overwhelming for me, where there were a lot of women like that who I knew growing up. And it was wonderful to know them because often, even though we wouldn't date or be boyfriend and girlfriend, many of them became good friends of mine. And those were friendships that were very much worth having, that I was certainly very fortunate to have them in my life. And and I had my songs to turn to and music to turn to, again, kind of as a coping mechanism of dealing with all these emotions that I really couldn't do much of anything with because I wasn't close or intimate with these women. So that's how I got through that in many ways.
The perils of young love.
Oh, it's true. Yeah.
Tough for us all.
Every heterosexual male songwriter who I know, and I know a good number of them, we all confess, what else really is there to write about when you're writing songs at that age? I mean, sure, I had a couple of songs that dealt with other matters, and those songs turned out, as you'd imagine, to be very, very good songs, very emotive and substantive, because of who I was writing about, the kind of people I knew who inspired these songs. And very fortunate, again, to have that as a coping mechanism and something I could turn to channel emotions that otherwise I wouldn't have been able to channel properly.
Sure. Is that something you're still doing regularly, still songwriting?
Not nearly to the extent that I did when I was growing up, but I do have a piano at home that I play. Not nearly to the degree that I used to, but from time to time. Too many other things to attend to. Yes. As a father, as a husband, as somebody working full time.
Sure.
Fortunately, to still have a job in the midst of this pandemic, but yes. Only so much time to sit and play the piano, which is okay. Things change.
It does.
But it's there, and I use it when I can, and it'll always be there. So that's all well and good.
That's wonderful. How has this sort of virtual realm of the pandemic been working for you with sort of talks? For us, it's nice we're able to have you, even though you're in Massachusetts and we're here in Princeton. Has it been helpful in that way for you?
Yes and no. Helpful in the sense of what you just said, Nora, in terms of finding it easier, less involved to get in front of people and to talk about the book or be interviewed about it. But the downside is clear that there really is no ideal substitution, certainly not, for face-to-face, in-person communication in terms of the book events that I did. And consequently, what I'm finding as a result of that is that understandably not as many books are selling through the virtual medium as I would be able to sell at an in-person event. And I accept that for what it is. We're in a situation that I feel is temporary. I learned going through life that it's very important to set realistic expectations for things. So I don't let the fact that book sales have been slow to get me down. I just see the situation for what it is, and it dawned on me, well, let's present the book virtually. It's better than nothing. Let's go ahead and do that. And I have sold, somewhat of a quantity of books, but not nearly to the extent that I was able to get people to buy the book as a result of in-person events. It's not the same, but it's better than nothing.
Yes, we've been finding ways to make it work for us as well. You're an author. I'm a librarian. I have a book question for you. Sure. Especially for young people but people of all ages, we know that representation in literature, both fiction and nonfiction, really matters. Over the past few years, we've seen a rise in what are called own voices titles, where books are being written by more and more people whose voices weren't always represented in the past, which includes writers who are on the autism spectrum, writing either memoirs or fiction works featuring characters who share those characteristics. Is anything that is that something? Do you seek out books like that, or anything that your son reads? You find that you are finding those books?
Prior to starting work on my own book, I had read a few books by people on the autism spectrum. A woman by the name of Leanne Holiday Willie wrote a book called Pretending to be Normal. Like me, this is a wife, a spouse, and a mother on the autism spectrum. There's another book called Beyond the Wall by Stephen Shore. I think I got the name right, S-H-O-R-E, who's married but without kids, and who I actually saw present at one of the conferences here in Massachusetts that I presented at. I read a good chunk of those two books and was very moved by what I read. And combined with certain people who knew me, who had read my blogs, my writing started out writing blogs. Certain people in the community asked me to write a book, largely because they felt that my family situation is really quite novel, that I'm a father on the autism spectrum in a neurodiverse marriage, meaning that my wife is not autistic, but I am, and with a son who is also on the spectrum, that I would talk about that a little bit with people, and they thought, gee, you got to write a book about that. This is a very novel kind of family situation that you're in. And so their encouragement combined with my blog writing kind of led to me concluding, yeah, why don't I tell my own story and make it a self-help book as well that people could actually use to help themselves. And that goes back to the whole paying it forward mission and honoring my parents' legacy.
Yeah.
That plays into that. So I have read a few books. Not so much my son, because he has plenty of work and reading to do for school. Mm-hmm. But maybe in time he'll read a little bit more about the autism spectrum, if anything, to learn more about himself. Maybe one day, God willing, he'll read my book, but I'm not counting on it. That might be a little too awkward for him, but we'll see.
Do you think that if we have more and more sort of books by people who have lived these experiences, that can help move us more from just awareness to acceptance, having more people kind of in the world, see that, again, we share a lot, it's not a you versus us type thing. It's, we're all just people in the world.
Absolutely, without question. I'm often telling people, an organization that I'm a community member in, the Asperger Autism Network, headquartered here in Massachusetts. They had a group of writers on the spectrum who did a summer workshop through AANE, and I was a guest speaker for that group of people. And I urged them, I said, look, everybody on the autism spectrum is different. No two people on the spectrum are the same. The more of you can tell your own stories, ideally through writing, just in terms of being able to reach more people that way, than to just be talking about it with people who are immediately around you. The more of that you can do, the better, because people need to hear our stories. They need to hear what it is that we go through, what our challenges are, the adversities we've faced, the things that we have going for ourselves that are good, just so that people can arrive at a greater understanding of what it is like to live on the spectrum, but yet we're all different, sometimes in very profound ways. My struggles and challenges can be opposite to others. And all the more importance for more of us rather than fewer of us to tell our stories so that the greater public has that understanding of what the autism spectrum is, which is a very, very wide diversity of various profiles, personality traits, challenges, etc.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Wonderful. I wonder if we could turn to your book briefly. If you would give us a sample of the book itself.
Sure.
I'm gonna.
All right. So in many ways, I look at my book as kind of being an act of goodwill um, to the world that I can give the world. In the midst of all the craziness, the divisiveness, the toxicity that we're dealing with in society. And this paragraph that I'm going to share is towards the very end of the book, and it kind of touches on this idea of the importance of goodwill, and that if we had more of it in society, of what we could achieve. And it goes like this. On Thanksgiving Day in 2018, a friend recruited me to volunteer with her at a local soup kitchen. As great as it felt to be reaching out to the hungry and homeless, that feeling paled in comparison to how awestruck I was when I heard how difficult it is simply to secure an opportunity to volunteer at the kitchen. My friend asked one of the folks who manages the kitchen about when she should call in so that she would be one of the first to be considered for a volunteer position for Christmas Day that year. Even then, she could not be sure that she would be able to offer her services. Oftentimes, she called the kitchen the instant it was scheduled to start fielding calls from would-be volunteers, only to be repeatedly greeted by a busy signal. After hearing this, I thought to myself, if only goodwill of this magnitude could assume a life of its own, take flight, and extend itself to where it is needed the most. Goodwill toward our planet, goodwill between differently minded people, enabling them to say no to hostility, to agree to disagree, to reach out and compromise, or to at least learn to peacefully coexist. Goodwill that keeps a would-be bully from targeting someone, or that levels the playing field for those who currently play according to different sets of rules. Yes, I admit that I am engaging in utopian wishful thinking, but wouldn't it be nice? This is the kind of world in which my son proceeds with his life, though only in my dreams. There's a lot in there that certainly rings true with our current situation in this country. And this comes out of the final chapter, which in a book that is primarily memoir and self-help is the one chapter where I look ahead. And as a father, naturally, when I look ahead, I do so with my son in mind. And I do so in writing about what my hopes are for him as he journeys through his life, what I want for the world that he'll be growing up in. And so there's a lot of emotional power in writing about that when you're trying to look into the future and you're revolving that vision of the future around your hopes and dreams for your son, that not all but much of this chapter as you can maybe imagine, was written with tears in my eyes. And much of the book I actually was writing in public. I didn't do all my writing in private. And so maybe you can begin to imagine this person sitting at a table at the market cafe at a local Wegmans supermarket, which is where I happen to write a fair amount of this book, just buried in my laptop with tears in my eyes and what people walking by might have thought of me as they were walking by seeing this. But that's a big theme in the book, is this theme of acceptance, that even though I have quirky behaviors, even though I might display certain awkward tendencies in public, the importance of just being who you are, as long as you're not emotionally or psychologically or physically hurting other people. So I figured, look, it's not like in doing what I'm doing, sitting here with tears in my eyes, that I'm hurting anybody. And if people actually knew what I was doing and knew what I was writing about, they'd probably understand why there were tears. But that kind of self-acceptance can be very, very difficult to arrive at. But I was very fortunate to be able to arrive at that kind of understanding that I am who I am. I'm human. You win some and you lose some. And what you do can't always satisfy everybody around you. And so if I'm quirky like that at times, it's fine. It's all well and good. And that took a long time for me to arrive at that sentiment. But I talk a lot about that notion of self-acceptance in the chapter of the book that deals with how I learned to love myself and of the self-esteem building process. That without self-acceptance, how are you ever going to get there? And if you don't get there, how are you going to ever truly find happiness in the one life that you have to live?
That's so wonderful. And I mean, that image of you in the Wegmans.
Exactly, you can begin to imagine.
But that's such a beautiful testament to how much of yourself that you've put into the book, and how
Correct.
this is a a personal journey that is like so much of yourself going out into the world, again, kind of living that paying it forward notion that you've focused this outreach on. And
I look at it as wearing the inside out, but to an extent. We all have things that are private that really shouldn't be shared with other people. It's not as though my life and everything I believe and everything I've been through is 100% an open book. But I felt, I guess, enough courage to share a lot of things that maybe other people would be reluctant to share. And I think that adds to the value that the book can bring to its audience.
yes, excellent. Well, I don't see any questions at the moment from the audience, although please toss them in if you have one. I think you've been very thorough in your discussion, so that we may have answered all of their questions already. But if you could take us briefly just to your website, let us know where we can find sort of more resources or further reading if people want to engage with you further.
All right, so the website is www.samfarmerauthor.com. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen now. All right, so this is the website. It talks about the book, and there are buttons that you can click on to buy the book. There are some reviews here. That's basically the book page. The author page, predictably, talks about me and who I am and why I wrote the book. There are fields here where you can subscribe to my newsletter, which I send out fairly regularly. Whenever I write an article and once that article is published, people on my mailing list find out about newly written material. They find out about these virtual book presentations and when they are and how to get to them. Now the media tab, this is the tab that when I update the website, predictably, I'm spending the most time on this page. A whole bunch of blogs and articles that I've already written, they're here, and this list will only continue as I continue to do more writing of articles. There are videos and interviews here. Many of these videos are coaching videos that I've done for the Asperger Autism Network. Here's a podcast called Through Our Autistic Eyes that I was on. Links to just all of this material. That's on the media page. Events is pretty self-explanatory. There's the event that we're at now. And I've got another one coming up through the Princeton Jewish Center, right down the road from the library on November 16th. Events are posted here. Resources. These are organizations in the community that I think are important for the community to be aware of. Social Thinking, the Asperger Autism Network, the College Internship Program. This list perhaps will gradually grow as I start perhaps to make connections with other organizations. And then the contact page. This is where any of you can contact me for whatever reason. And if any of you would want a book that you would want me to sign, what you can do is you can reach out to me here and I'll get the message in my email inbox. I work with a point of sale application that provides a secure page where books can be purchased. And then once they're purchased, I find out about it. I have a bunch of books here with me at home that I can sign it and put it in the mail. And that would be one way that if you want a signed book, that you can obtain one that way directly from me. Questions about the book. If any of you have groups of people or communities that you are members of where you feel that a book presentation would be worthwhile to have, certainly share that. And the more of these presentations that I can give, the better. And that's basically what Sam Farmer Author is all about. And would be great to hear from people. And no matter what, if you reach out to contact me, then I guarantee you that I'll get back to you. Might take a little while depending upon how busy I am, but I will reach out. And that's how I can be reached for whatever reason.
Excellent. I have reopened the chat in case anyone has final thoughts. We did have one comment from Doug who thanked you for your book and for taking the time to share your story with our community, saying it's truly appreciated. So so I will echo Doug's statement.
Thank you very much.
Before we say goodbye, is there a sort of a last kind of favorite bit of advice that you would give to maybe young people, especially who are facing any kind of difficulty, whether it's, something like, really, and we'll just leave it at any kind of difficulty that you find that you would like to give them?
No matter what adversities you face, whatever challenges you might be confronting, whatever it is you're up against, just be who you are work hard at accepting who you are, at loving who you are. If you find that you need help getting there, that help exists. Reach out and grab it, because you deserve to be able to accept, love, and be who you are at all costs.
I love that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much again for joining us. This has been a great conversation for me. I hope you have also enjoyed it. It's really been excellent having you here. And I know our audience is appreciative also of your time and your experience. And again, just thank you very much for being here.
Thanks very much, folks. Thank you, Nora. And if any of you think of questions or have any comments, now you know how to reach me through samfarmerauthor.com. Don't be shy about it. Reach out, and I promise I'll get back to you. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Thank you again, everyone. And remember that you can follow the library both on our Crowdcast page and our main events page on the library's website, princetonlibrary.org. Thank you very much again for joining us, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you.